So we've got good audio there. So the mic is working.
On this.
Yeah.
Now it's going.
Okay, so it's working here.
Yeah. So let's try.
I touched that.
Okay.
All right, so now go back to. All right, now we're back on. Oh. You're hearing me? Oh, wow. It is. I just had to hit that button. That's cool. It's the red. It's the microphone. And it should go up to number 10, or start new. You just don't want to record over something else. Huh? Okay. Just hit record now. And it should start a new one. Is that too loud, Mike? I turned this up just a little bit. I'll turn it down. Just in here.
Wow, we're a small crowd today, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
Pretty much. Still pretty exhausted, but like, it is what it is.
Exhaustion is a companion. Didn't you know that?
All right. Well, expect to see Laura. Is she coming? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah, I just saw Laura email. It sounded like she was planning on it. Okay, well, now that we have our mic going, we figured out something that was causing us problems the last couple of weeks, so that's good. I'm not gonna leave music. It was my turn to leave music today, but I'm a little tired, and I'm just going to reserve energy for the discussion this morning. So, if we want to, I don't know, sing an a cappella something or something, that's fine. Or if we just want to go into prayer time, that's fine as well, which would be my vote. My wife says, great, let's do it. Okay, so now that I've got the mic going, I'm going to turn off the mic, and we're going to Thank you. I appreciate that. We've been in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, so we're going to start right back there. Last time we met, I summarized just a couple of things real quickly at the end of that chapter. Some of these bigger concepts like stumbling block, a brother perishing, sinning against Christ. Some of these things, I said very quickly a few things about that, but I'd like to make sure that those things are clear and that we are sensitive to those things. Paul uses some very strong language there, and I think that's for a reason, and we don't want to take that language lightly. So I want to make sure we properly understand that and have the proper impact on our own lives before going into chapter 9, which I'd like to get to, if we can this morning, begin to introduce chapter 9. But I want to begin with an example this morning. Let's see if we can appreciate the weaker brother's perspective by just considering an example for a moment. Let's say Joshua and I meet up in a movie theater, okay? He's coming in, I've just watched a movie, right? And he comes in, he's paid his money, he walks through, and we meet in the halls. I've just come out, and he's like, oh, hey, what'd you see? And I'm like, oh, I watched what's that one movie, Soph, that we want? No. I don't know, some Disney princess show like that Soph and I have watched together, and my soul's aching. And Frozen maybe or something. Yeah, Frozen 3 or 4, we're like, okay, I just watched Frozen 5, and it sucked my will to live. Joshua, how are you doing? And he's like, oh, fine, I'm going to watch this. And then he sees me turn, and instead of leaving, I go walk into another theater. And I watch another movie. And Joshua sees me do that. I want to ask you a question. How's Joshua going to respond to that? Is he going to think, well, if Mr. Friedman did that, maybe it's okay for people to do that? Is that going to be his thought? Possibly, but that's probably easily disproved, right? Right? Joshua's going, no, that's not. Joshua, what are you going to think? What the heck? Why are you doing that? Because you're going to think that's wrong, right? You're going to think, that's, I think, illegal. I think he just stole something right then, right? So what are you going to have to think about my conscience and what I do? What's my relationship with my conscience? What are you going to have to conclude about that? It's conflicted, and that I'm willing in some way to go against my conscience about a matter, right? That I'm willing to do something that I know is wrong, that I know for sure is wrong. How does that impact Joshua?
Kind of discouraging. Like, here I am trying to do things well, and doesn't even matter.
And here's this guy who, maybe he respects me, but at least he feels like probably has a better handle on certain Christian things than he does, right? Been in the faith longer. That would probably be pretty discouraging, wouldn't it? Let's take that now and just say from a weaker brother perspective. The weaker brother is absolutely convinced that if you go into that idol house and you eat that meat sacrificed to that idol, that is dishonoring to God. That is wrong. He is convinced in his mind that it's wrong. For him to see a stronger brother do so, what does he think? Well, he could potentially think, oh, well, maybe that's okay for me to do. Maybe that's not as wrong as I think it is. That's a potential, but there's a problem even in that. But secondly, what if he thinks what Joshua thinks? What if he thinks, well, that guy's just doing something that he knows is wrong, and he's going against what is right. He's violating his conscience. And maybe he thinks, maybe I'm taking all this too seriously. Maybe walking by my conscience and what's right and wrong is not as important as I think it is. Maybe it's okay to do that, to go against my conscience. Is that a possibility? I think that's a possibility. Now, there's a bigger issue too. I mean, even if he doesn't think it, even if he thinks, well, maybe it's okay for me to eat that food offered to idols. Even if that's his thought, if he abandons his conviction because of my example, something has just died in that believer. What is it? Exactly.
Maybe what the Holy Spirit might convict him of later on. It
Listen-
creates a distrust of Christian people.
Well, I think it creates a distrust of his own convictions, right? Like maybe my convictions that I am convicted of by what I understand right now from God and my position, you know, maybe that's not as important as I think it is, right? That is the potential for real damage in a Christian's life. You know, and I want us to think about this. I don't think I've emphasized this as much as I probably should have, but I want to run this by you. I think it falls into play with everything that we talked about, but I just want to bring it out and emphasize it for a moment. Consider a Corinthian who is an unbeliever. As an adult, week in and week out, they go to the idol house, right? And at that idol house, they partake in the food that's sacrificed to the idol. They see the image of the idol. They see the image of that goddess Aphrodite. And that image provokes fleshly lusts, concupiscence, wantonness. They get drunk by drinking the drink that's there. They engage in worship of that false god, that Aphrodite false god, with the prostitutes that are there. They eat the food that is sacrificed to honor that god. And this is practiced week in and week out. This is part of who they are. It's kind of just what we do as Corinthians, right? It's just what he and his friends and his family do. This is just normal. This is who I am. As a Corinthian, this is what we do. And then he hears the gospel. And he goes, I'm different now. I'm not just a sinful Corinthian any longer. I'm not just an unbelieving Corinthian. And he thinks back to that idol house experience and he goes, everything associated with that idol temple is my old sinful life. I want nothing to do with it. The drink there, the food there, the practices there, the idol worship there is all my walking in darkness, my sinful, ungodly, unbelieving self. And I want nothing to do with that any longer, right? And so everything that happens there and is associated with that, he says, that's who I was, but that's not who I am anymore. So he doesn't want to go back to the idol house. He doesn't want anything to do with the alcohol at the idol house. He didn't want anything to do with the food that is sacrificed in honor of that goddess. He didn't want anything to do with that goddess. He didn't want anything to do with those things. Is that a fair thing for him to think at that moment? Absolutely. In fact, it's a fairly righteous thing, right?
It's a loving God.
It is a loving God kind of a thing, and loving that new opportunity as a new identity, to walk in that new identity. But then consider that being challenged by a respected, knowledgeable brother going to that idol house, and him going, wait a minute, I want nothing to do with any of that. That's who I was. I practiced all that, and I don't want to be there and do those things. But he sees a respected, knowledgeable brother go and take part in what's going on there. Maybe the brother doesn't visit the prostitute. Maybe the brother doesn't get drunk, but he eats the food. Maybe he drinks the drink, and then he goes home. Can you see how that weaker brother is like, hold on a minute. I want nothing to do with that, but you just went and partook. What's the difference? The difference is establishment. The difference is maybe that brother, that stronger brother goes, you know what? I know that Aphrodite thing is nothing. It's just an imagined, that idol is nothing, as the scripture says. That idol is nothing, right? And it doesn't matter. And I know that food is just food, and it's fine. And it doesn't matter if it's bought here or if I go down to Albertsons and I buy it there. It doesn't matter. It's just food. And that stronger brother has those convictions, and so he takes that food and he eats it as if he bought it at Albertsons, and it doesn't matter, or Winco or wherever. But to that weaker brother, there's all this other stuff associated with that. There's all that old sinful life identity and association. And so he looks at it and goes, whoa, that's not okay. I think this is something that we want to be very careful of. And we talked about how a defiled conscience is the result for that weaker brother. And so here's the terminology. Let's open things back up here, and let's make sure that we're very clear about the terminology and what Paul's talking about when he uses some of the strong language, defiled conscience, stumbling block, so forth and so on. It begins, let's say verse 7, howbeit there is not in every man that knowledge. For some, with conscience of the idol unto this hour, eat it as a thing offered unto an idol. And their conscience being weak is defiled. Okay, so we talked about that conscience being defiled, meaning they violate their own conscience. They're convinced it's wrong, but because the stronger brother is doing it, they go, well, maybe I just need not worry about the conviction of my conscience at this moment. Maybe I should just go ahead and eat that thing. They're defiling their conscience. They're violating what they feel is right in that moment. But there's something beyond that defilement as well, right? There's something that's severed. They now are going to follow the example of a brother rather than their own conviction. And let's expand that, their own conviction that should be what? Based upon God's word, right? Based upon what they're convicted by God himself. We as stronger brethren don't want to get in the way of a weaker brother and their conviction from God. That's huge. So the defiled conscience, violated and broken in that connection with God. Verse 8, but meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. And we have to be very clear about that. I'm not better because I can eat the meat sacrificed to the idol without a worry. That God is not impressed with that. He is not the worse because he doesn't eat the food sacrificed to the idol. He is in no way seen as less than in God's eyes. That weaker brother is in no way seen as less than, right? It doesn't matter. Verse 9, but take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. And of course that stumbling block concept means you're on a path. You're moving forward and something is in your way that would cause you to trip up, cause you to stop your progress. That progress being primarily, guys, I think, your walking functional relationship with God. Verse 10, for if any man see thee, which hast knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? Now this is interesting. Let's back up for just a sec. Verse 10, for if any man see thee, we may think, well, they're not going to actually, the weaker brother won't know that I did this. So I'm going to go and do it and expect that the weaker brother's not going to hear about it, right? But he says, but if any man see thee, which hast knowledge, sit at meat in the idol temple. What is he saying? Well, if Joshua doesn't see me there, Keith might, and word might get back to Joshua that I'm there doing that thing, right? There's plenty of times where in Christian circles we could say, well, yeah, but Pastor so-and-so, I've seen him do this or this, right? And you may not have had to watch him do it to know that he's doing it. You know what I'm saying? Dad?
I think there's a time right about then when we need to encourage one another to be careful of what you see.
Mm-hmm.
A person going into a grocery store and buying a 6-pack of alcohol, another person can say, oh, he must be a drunk.
Mm-hmm.
And really all you're seeing is him buying a 6-pack of alcohol.
Right.
You're not witnessing, incorrect behavior or something like that. So I just think sometimes we need to stress that, and I'm not concerned about the stronger brother in that case, but the weaker brother needs to be careful to say, well,
I only saw this. I didn't
saw
see
this,
something else.
so I don't need to conclude something there.
Right. And I think that's very fair. We don't want to be... Back in Romans 14, when Paul talks about it, he says it both ways. He says, the weaker brother need not judge the stronger brother for certain things. And so that there's some of that balancing perspective. At the same time, I think it is important for us to just be mindful I went to a cousin's get together last year, and there was some alcohol consumption there, and I wasn't real concerned about my example, but at the same time, well, I was for my own kids and for my, for other people, for other younger people that were there, but just knowing, certain people knowing that, there's some alcohol consumed there and there's some things, and that I'm there. I guess some people could make an issue of that. You know what I mean? And in that word can get around. And so I can see that there's something to just being mindful of what I'm involved in, that maybe I'm not being witnessed exactly by certain people, but other people may hear about it. And I think that's important as well. But again, if any man see thee which hast knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? Emboldened. This term emboldened here is actually really fascinating. And I'm so thankful for good Bible teachers who've done some homework. I didn't find this out by my own study, but good old Jeremy Shellman, a guy who taught us in Mesa for many years. This emboldened, this is the same Greek word that is in verse 1 of this chapter. And you know what that word is translated to? Edifieth. Now that's interesting, isn't it? It's the same word, same Greek word, but it's translated emboldened here. Same Greek word. Other places it's to build up. It's the concept of edify. However, the translators decided emboldened is better here for English-speaking people. Why? Well, emboldened means to make fearless. Or courageous. Or daring. Right?
The way that you get to that
Yeah.
is different.
How did I get there?
Edify, you're being educated,
Yes.
knowing something, learning something. Here, you're just, it's almost kind of like not like a blind faith, but
Or you're learning something.
yeah, but not in the same way. It's a different mechanism
It's not
for getting
of
there.
your own conviction.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not maybe because of your own experience, your own. You're kind of taking
You're
the example of somebody else.
taking the example of somebody else and going, well,
Good enough for them.
if it's good enough for me, I will dare to do so likewise, right? And that's the emboldening. That's okay, I don't fear to do this any longer because that person did it. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. The fact that this term, though, strikes me as this is the horrible substitute for this, right? This ought to be what happens. They ought to be edified and then come to their own conclusion and says, you know what, maybe that idol's nothing. And maybe that meat really is just like anything else that God created for us to be received with thanksgiving. But unless it's edification that does that, it's just an emboldening. It's just okay. And now what are we going to cast aside in the process? Well, this is where he goes to, this is where he goes to in verse 11. And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. The weak brother perishes. Obviously we know that's not him going to hell. That's not him losing his eternal salvation. We know that. What is perishing? When something perishes, it comes to a sudden end, to a violent sudden stop, and it ceases to function. He's no longer led by the Spirit. Exactly. He's no longer led by the edification process and by the Spirit storing up sound doctrine in his heart and soul, that his mind is renewed thereby, and where he can identify that perfect, that good and acceptable and perfect will of God in that situation, right? That's how he's supposed to be doing it, by the renewing of his mind And now I can identify what is good, what is acceptable, what is perfect that I can do before my God. That's how edification. That's not what's happening. This is a substitute process. And so what is really being broken? What is really being broken, guys, is what so many times I think we talk about, this relationship with God, this personal relationship with God. You probably don't hear me use that terminology very often, like we need to have a personal relationship with God. Because so often people talk about that in terms of salvation, and so I don't use that terminology. But if there's any personal relationship with God that would matter for you as an individual, as a Christian, it's what Mike was talking about in his prayer. Being able to identify what is good that I can do that honors the Lord. How can I, in my circumstances, each day go out and honor God? At work, at home, in my practices, in the entertainment that I enjoy, all these things. And identifying and walking with the Lord and working through what I know, what God has taught me, and prayerfully coming to conclusions about what is good and what is acceptable and what is perfect for me to be doing that honors my Father. The moment that is no longer your thought process, and instead your thought process is, well, Mike does it, so I guess I'll go do it. Or Keith does it, so I guess I'll go do it. That relationship with God as your Father perishes. Because you're no longer concerned about what is God teaching me and how can I honor him and what have I learned from my Father and what can I prayerfully take before him. Do you guys see the difference?
I'm just going to bring up you made these 2 points that not only do you think, oh, I'm going to go do that too, but sometimes you just get the discouragement where you're like, maybe I'm just being too religious.
Yes.
And I think that I have definitely felt that feeling, and I can understand how it makes you just question what you believe, it makes you question God, it makes you question all of these things, and then you feel like you have to make some compromise, and giving up what you feel from God, you have to compromise, and that is, it's not just, oh, I'm emboldened to do this thing, but there's also I'm discouraged from doing something I was emboldened through faith to do before. That was maybe a hard thing already.
Right.
And it takes away your oomph to follow after what God would have you to do.
Well, it takes away your fear of doing something almost in the same way. It's a different type of emboldening. It's emboldening through discouragement of standards.
Yes, because we both want to eat the steak, right? The strong brother and the weak brother are both like, you know what? That looks pretty good. I'm happy to eat that. The one says, but that was sacrificed to Aphrodite. I don't want to honor her. That's a false god. I want nothing to do with that. And the other one's going, that's really nothing. It's no big deal. It's just a piece of food. It's all right. You know, but if the one sees the other do, it's like, well, I'm making this big deal and that guy doesn't really care about it. And it's kind of that throwing up your hands and going,
I get to serve God and I get no steak.
Yep.
And he's getting steak and he's serving God.
And he's serving God.
So,
this kind of stinks. Right. So that can be the discouragement that can also, obviously, in both situations, it's a perishing of really being concerned about what God thinks and what really honors God, and being convinced through study and through the intake of his word, and then being led by the Spirit that would bring us to the conclusions about what's good to do. That ceases. That's the perishing. Yes. Yes, that's the perishing. Mike, did you have a...
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I think it's easy for, I don't know, not necessarily more mature Christians, to look at the weaker brother, younger Christian, and say, by you not participating in having a drink, you're living legalistically.
Legalistically, yes.
You should just take a drink. Obviously, we would say that's them being immature, not
Yes.
the weaker brother. But I think there's strength in living and knowing your weaknesses. Like if that weaker brother is not considering himself justified by his actions, it's just like, you know what, I spent a lot of time in this idol house and I really don't want anything ever to do with it. That's just fine. He could live the rest of his life that way.
Absolutely.
And
that would not really be a detriment to him in any way, right?
That's wisdom. It's not him saying, this justifies me. It's just
Nope.
saying, well, I was tempted when I was here. I left a bad taste in my mouth, I never ever want to go back.
Exactly.
I think it's important to respect that aspect of it too. The strength in knowing the weakness.
Yeah, and strength in saying, that was me, but I'm not that anymore.
Right.
I'm going to walk in my new identity. And if that means I never drink another drop of alcohol, I'm fine. Great, because I don't want anything to do with that. Because, and today it's not the Idol House, but it's the bar, it's the whatever. I go and I do all these different things, and I do it with what? With a drink in my hand. I look for women. I look to be, satisfied that way physically. I tell stories. I boast. I lie. I, get angry for no reason. I get into fights. I do all these things in these places, and I do it all with a beer in my hand and a few in my system. You know what I mean? And then he goes, I don't want to do that anymore. I want nothing to do with that old lifestyle. And the beer was the commonality, right? The beer was the thing that I always had in my hand when I was doing those things. I just don't want that anymore. I'm just done with it. You're right. Nothing about that is keeping him back from maturing in the Lord, right? As long as he continues to walk in clearness of conscience and what he knows to be true and follow along in the edification process, if he continues to say, just don't want to do that, there's nothing wrong with that. And he can grow up and he can mature and he can be just fine for the rest of his life in that conviction.
So do all the other people around that don't have that experience and have a beer once in a while, should they not drink anymore because of his conviction?
No. I think for a while, perhaps they should. They should be cognizant and be careful of him. But he's going to mature. And he's going to get to the point where he may still say, I want nothing to do with that. But he may, as an established son, go, but I am perfectly fine with you doing that. Because now I'm established and now I understand that it's okay and that there can be some benefit to wine. Paul addresses Timothy and says, take a little wine for thy stomach's sake. He can get to that point in his own edification where he realizes, okay, I don't have to expect that if Mike has a beer, he's doing what I used to be doing when I had a beer in my hand, when I was an unbeliever. I don't have to equate the two, and he can be okay with Mike. But that's it. He's an established brother, right? But until he gets established, maybe we're careful with him. Maybe we're like, hey, you know what? That's great. But that's the point. And so, what Paul says is, well, let's not skip this. When ye so, and through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. But when we sin so against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, we sin against Christ. Two things here, guys, in verse 12. Sinning against the weak brethren and sinning against Christ. We need to recognize that Paul actually calls this, God, through Paul, calls this sin. When we're not considerate of a weaker brother, we're sinning against that brother. We're actually causing a serious problem. He's saying you're sinning. Lying, stealing, cheating, adulterating. He's saying you're sinning against the brother. No, I don't think I normally, think of it in those terms, but he says, you sin so against the brethren. That's pretty powerful. And wound their weak conscience. Cause damage to that weak conscience that is just needing to mature and needing to grow up in the foundational truth of who they are in Christ and what the real truth is. We're sinning against the brother, but then maybe more importantly, he says, we're sinning against Christ. Sinning against Christ himself. I'm sure we can think of things. In fact, we could turn back to Acts chapter 9. Christ identifies himself with the believers, with all believers. And in fact, when Paul meets Christ on the road to Damascus, you remember what Christ says to him. Acts chapter 9, verses 3, 4, and 5. It says, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Right? Why persecutest thou me? What's Saul doing? Imprisoning Christians, right? He's imprisoning believers. But Christ says, you're doing it to me. You probably remember Matthew 25. Anything that you do to the least of these, you've done to me. right? So Christ identifies himself. But I don't think it's just I don't think it's just that. It's not that we're sinning against the brother and therefore we're sinning against Christ. I think it is that, but I think there's something more to that. What is Christ wanting to do? Like, what is he trying to accomplish with these brethren? He's trying to grow them up. He's holding back God's wrath right now so that we have an opportunity to grow up in the truth and become founded, established, mature sons and daughters so that we can go out there and exercise to his honor and glory. And if we as stronger brethren are getting in the way of that because we want a piece of steak or because we want to have a drink, we are sinning against him and what he's trying to accomplish and his lead. That's what's fascinating to me, guys, is that this verbiage, ye sin against Christ, I can't find it, and maybe I've missed it somewhere, and I haven't scoured it all together, but I don't see Paul use that terminology about any other issue in Paul's epistles. You know, you're sinning against Christ. He uses it here in relation to this issue. That's pretty powerful. So what does Paul conclude? Verse 13, wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. And Mom asked the pertinent question. So what does that mean? Do we just never have a drink or never eat meat because there may be somebody with this conviction? Well,
Because there's new believers all the time.
you would really hope there are new believers all the time, right? Not all of them do. But what's fascinating to me is that as I think about mature Christians that I've seen, a lot of them are very careful about certain things. They're careful about the way they handle themselves around alcohol. They're careful about the way they handle themselves around things that they know is something that's popularly identified with, for lack of a better word, pagan culture, right? And they're careful about that. And I think there's wisdom there. And I'm not saying that you or anybody else would have to never have another drink of alcohol in the presence of other people or something like that. That's not what I'm saying. But this is interesting for us to ponder what Paul's saying here. Now, we know that in different places, Paul behaves differently. In chapter 10, he's going to say as much. When he's with the Gentiles, he behaves like a Gentile. When he's with Israel, he eats kosher. Right? Why? So that he can not have a hindrance to his gospel message going out. So I don't think Paul is a strict teetotaler. He's mindful of the people that he's involved with, and he's mindful of who he's around. Does it sometimes come back to bite him? Yes. Because the people of Jerusalem are hearing that he's out there preaching among the Gentiles, that they don't have to circumcise their kids and they don't have to follow the law. And that word gets back to Jerusalem, right? They take issue with that. But when he's with Israel in Jerusalem, he goes and he fulfills the vow in the temple. And he eats kosher, and he's mindful of them. But they still heard about what he was preaching to the Gentiles. It still got back to him. Dad?
When you began teaching on this, it seemed like you were coming from a place of the weaker brother having issues with going back or a violation of former Jewish
Yes.
related issues, like eating meats that are forbidden and things like that.
Yes.
Now it seems like we're getting into a kind of a different discussion of things that might be associated with evil practice and stuff like that. Would you want to comment on that?
Absolutely. I did, and I still think both are appropriate. I think the one is appropriate, and I think this is appropriate also. And that's why I wanted to take some time this morning to emphasize this side of it as well, meaning things that somebody someone who's coming out of an unbelieving lifestyle may be more sensitive to, because I think that really does kind of fit with what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 8 here, when he says that he eats it as a thing for some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol. You know, I think that can be both a Jewish perspective, but also a Gentile's perspective that says, I was unsaved and I had fellowship with all of that, but now I don't want to have fellowship with that. And now I'm wanting to be away from that.
Well, either way, it's a stumbling of a weaker brother because they believe God has forbidden this, right?
In a sense, yes, they're going to default to the.
Like technically in Jewish law, it's still a God prefers this. And that's what I believe. That's my conscience.
Right.
So it's either way. That's your default. It's a morally.
It is. It's a default because of a lack of establishment, right? Like, I as a new believer can't have anything to do with that, including moderately drinking alcohol or, taking any kind of food that was sacrificed to idol. I can't have anything to do with that because that would be going back to my sinful behavior.
And I believe God doesn't.
And I believe God doesn't want me to do that.
So that it is even if it's the law of their own hearts, it is a law of God they're attempting.
In a sense, and I want to be really careful because I don't want to open the door to it being super broad and any kind of, I used to be a video game addict, when I was an unbeliever, and I can't, I don't necessarily think that really applies. Like, oh man, Knox plays video games and I kind of respect that guy. You're throwing a stumbling block in front of that new, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to open it up that wide. I don't think it ought to be.
Yeah.
But there are certain things that are pretty common. Paul acknowledges both food and drink, and he specifies those things particularly, but especially associated with.
About, like the movie theater
Mm-hmm.
that you brought up earlier. That's a form of stealing.
Yes.
And so there's things that are like if it falls within like Ten Commandments kind of idea, generic,
Mm-hmm.
morally questionable things, whereas video games are much more
Oh yeah. Yeah.
loosey-goosey. It seems like
But even that, don't get me wrong. I brought that up that example saying that's clearly wrong, right? Stealing at the movie theater by watching another movie is clearly wrong.
that's just the
And then I associated just the weaker brother and his
But that's the
perspective
point
of that.
The weaker brother, it doesn't have to be food and drink. It doesn't have to be something that's Jewish law. It is something that is known to be wrong and or right.
Mm-hmm.
Usually you have a moral conviction, a personal conscious
Yes.
about those topics, not about something totally random.
Right.
Right?
Okay, so
But Dad,
can we broaden our discussion a bit? What about somebody who has had an issue on computers looking at things that they shouldn't look at? Or phones? Does that mean that, we need to say, well, I'd probably be better off not to have a computer or not to have an iPhone or whatever, just so that I avoid the appearance that I might be, associated with such stuff?
mm-hmm. I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think I can show a very responsible use of, and maybe protections, things like, hey, we have these programs on here that are make me accountable to my wife and my kids and other people, so I don't,
Well, you can make a
get myself into trouble or.
You can make a similar statement about carrying guns, right? There's a lot of people who would say, oh, well, God doesn't want us to kill, right? And so why would you carry a lethal weapon? But there's a good, like, morally righteous reason for you to carry, and I don't think you could say that it's morally a wrong thing to carry for the purpose of self-protection and protection of others. But some people may believe that it is. And so do you just never carry? Do you never go out shooting? Do you never educate like your family on the proper use of firearms? Just because some people might think it's wrong to use them? No, not necessarily, right? So it's those things are it can be a personal conviction to be like, oh, I think this is wrong, but you're not actively doing whatever it is, right? Like if you're to have a computer, I don't see that as something that's wrong, but if you were to have a computer and for some reason show that you're doing something that's morally questionable with that, it's really hard to say that there's anything that, as a stronger brother, you could do with good faith
Yeah.
and good conscience with something like that.
Yeah.
And for a weaker brother to be like, oh, that's not okay. Like, video games would be like
Wh-
as close as you can get, I guess.
What do you think, Dad?
Yeah, I think that's a really good, I think the gun example is really good. I really like this distinction between emboldened and edified, or,
Mhm.
I think that's a really important thing to
Mm-hmm.
kind of keep in mind. I guess the struggle is, where do you resist your own freedom to buy a steak or whatever, as opposed to, trying to think about not representing yourself in the wrong way or something.
Yeah. It's not terribly easy necessarily to figure all that out. Laura?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with your knowledge of the weaker brother that you're around.
Yeah.
A lot of what we're talking about has to do with your knowledge of the weaker brethren. Everybody has issues with something, but they're all going to be different. And so to refrain or restrict yourself from ever engaging or, using tools that we have available to us because you might potentially cause a weaker brother to stumble is pretty ridiculous. So I think a lot of it just has to do with what you know about the weaker brothers that are around you, the new believers that are around you, and even if at some point you learn something like, oh, okay, and from that point on you have that knowledge, so you behave differently when you're around them.
Like this person is,
Right.
yeah.
You found out, oh, you're recovering alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I won't serve wine with dinner next time I invite you over for dinner or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that you were wrong, when you didn't have that knowledge, necessarily. I guess, it depends. But
Well, and there's no harm in waiting
there's no harm
and getting to know that person,
Right.
right?
So,
And I think that would be probably the bigger lesson.
the prudent thing to do.
I think the prudent thing is, yeah, let's get to know these people before, for the first time eating together, we bring out, hey, would you like some of this? Well, maybe let's just get to know them first, and maybe let's just not bring it out,
But I guess maybe that was wrong, because like food and drink is pretty specifically spoken to here. I think maybe I'm
It-
speaking more to the outer
yeah,
things
to the outer things like Dad was bringing up, sure.
so much that
But that's where I think if Paul brings it up here,
yeah.
we can think about it, right? Like we can think about it carefully, and we can go, okay, it's probably pretty safe for me to be pretty cautious in the way I deal with these things,
So you're saying I can't serve
right?
dinner to new people?
No, but if you might ask, they're not a high Jew population. If they were certain things, and you might question, or
There are a lot of believers in our community that eat kosher.
yeah, there
A
are.
lot. I know a ton of people.
Mm-hmm. Well, in our small homeschool community circles, yes.
Yeah, in the
Yeah.
community.
And when we learn that, we try to respect it, but
So, I feel like we could talk about this section for
days.
endless amounts of weeks.
Yeah.
But part of the problem is I feel like we're exploring way like in this cloud of this idea when really this is a section of a bigger thing. And
Part of why I talked about,
reading off of context, I feel like.
yeah,
I think it might help to reduce the vagueness and the cloud that's surrounding it if we remind ourselves what the situation is.
We
what is
keep
Paul trying
moving.
to do, and why would he address this? What's he going to address next? How does it fit? Because
One of
I'm
the-
feeling like the more ideas we talk about, the more it gets a little fuzzy, and he's definitely just saying be considerate of others and don't be emboldening people to do things that are ungodly.
could be unconscionable.
Could be ungodly for that person and could
For that
lead them
person.
to not follow what they believe is God is telling them to do.
Yes.
And I think in this argument, he's also telling them, think about your actions, because some of the things I think they're doing in their freedom are ungodly things.
Yes, and that's
And
why I
that
brought
is
up.
an aspect of being, I feel like, thrown out, and it's important. Just because they're the stronger person doesn't mean they aren't being an idiot.
That's why I brought up what I did earlier. Let's consider, because chapter 10, Paul's going to take the Corinthians to task for going to the idol house as stronger brethren. Why would he do that? And it just be about them there, them taking the cup, them participating in what goes on at the idol house. And he's going to say things like, the cup of the blessing which we bless, verse 16, is it not the communion of the bread of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we being many are one bread and one body, but we are all, for we are all partakers of that one bread. Behold, I skipped down. Verse 19, what say I then? Is the idol anything, or that which is offered that sacrifices anything? No. But I say that the things that the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. I would not that you should have fellowship with devils. Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partaker of the Lord's table and the table of devils. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? What's Paul's point? Corinthians, what are you doing at the idol house anyway? Which would be a fair statement to us, right? If he's like, Mike, why are you still hanging out at the bar? What are you doing there? Are you witnessing to people? Do you have tracts in your hand? Are you saying, hey, brothers, let's talk about Jesus Christ and how you can be saved? Is that what you're doing there? Or are you just hanging out at the bar, drinking and commiserating with these people in what they're doing? And if the answer is, well, I'm just hanging out at the bar, he's saying, why are you there? What's the point? Are you actually living in your sanctified life, or are you just going back to the old habits, thinking you're being more mature because you can handle it, but you're honestly just having fellowship with things that are not good? That's where he's going to get it eventually, and that's why I brought up the weaker brother. This is what's so fascinating about this passage. The weaker brother is the one having the higher scruples, who says, I want nothing to do with that idol house and any of the activity that goes on there. The food sacrificed, any of that. Even the Jewish person. The Jewish person says, that's against the God, the one true living God. I want nothing to do with that stuff. That is unclean. That is dishonoring to God. I want nothing to do with that. What Paul does here is he says, okay, you stronger brethren, Corinthians, you think you know, and so you think you can partake in these things. Fine. Do I know that the idol is nothing? Yes. Am I concerned about unclean, not clean, clean? No. I'm not concerned about those things. However, for you to give that up for the weaker brethren's sake is very, very good. And more than that, for you to think you ought to just go and commiserate in that environment and with those people is highly questionable as a sanctified individual in Christ. And so that is where he goes. And that's kind of why I brought up the weaker brother perspective, Dad, from this perspective of that was my sinful past identity. And I don't want anything to do with that. That is a very good conviction. And yes, I know I can have a drink of alcohol. And yes, I know I can eat food that's sacrificed to idols, and it doesn't matter. But if I don't clearly make the distinction in my own mind as a more mature 20-year-old Christian, when I say 20-year-old, I've been in the faith for 20 years or whatever. If I'm not still eager to make a big distinction between my life now and what an unbeliever's life looks like, then maybe I need to reflect on how I'm taking my own sanctification, right? And how I'm actually practicing it. And so I think that's real important for us to see that and to realize maybe me wanting to exercise my maturity is actually just self-serving, right?
Because at the beginning of this, we learned the theme of the Corinthians, kind of the theme of the Corinthian culture was that they were living as kings. And they
Absolutely.
were absolutely wallowing in their liberty.
Yes.
And
They were respected among their community. People didn't think there was anything really different or unique about them. And they're like, oh, yeah, you Corinthians, you guys everybody loves you. They have no problem with you because you go back to your practices and you have adulterers in your midst and you act like it's no big deal. So, is there any reason for the community around them to go chafe? No, there's no reason for the community around them to chafe. They say, you're just like one of us. No big deal.
Well, and also at the beginning of 8, I think there is that statement that says that knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifies. And I thought when you were going to emboldened, when you're going to the word in verse 1, I thought it was going to be puffeth up. It's interesting that it was edified.
Mm-hmm.
But actually,
It's kind of like puffing up.
it is kind of like puffing up. The emboldened is kind of like
Mm-hmm.
puffed up because of, quote, knowledge.
Because of knowledge, because, I know that guy does it, so I guess I can go do it. So, yes, sweetheart, I think we do need to, we don't want to lose sight of that. What I think, guys, is actually going to happen with the Corinthians and maybe with us is, honestly, what Paul wants out of the Corinthians is probably going to look a lot more like what the weaker brother does already. Does that make sense? The practice of the more mature, loving brother is going to look like the weaker brother's stance, because he's going to be sensitive to not only what the weaker brother's conscience is, and therefore change his behavior, but he's also going to be sensitive to, what does this look like before my Father's eyes, and what I'm having fellowship with. And what?
Even what it looks like to the heavenly. Like our goal is to be able to be a light to everyone and everything around us.
Yeah.
I think that gets in the way. Even further than world or weaker brothers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I thought about opening with this, but I'm going to close with it. Philippians chapter 2. We talked a little bit about this passage last time, and I wanted to get down to this other portion of it. Philippians chapter 2. Remember the example of Christ that Philippians 2 verse 6, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. Remember, the stronger brother thinks, it's not a problem for me to eat that meat. It's not a problem for me to have a little bit of wine. That's not a problem. But for the sake of the weaker brethren, I'm going to condescend in that righteous, good, holy way, good, godly way, and I'm going to change my behavior for his sake. And I'm going to abide by, in a more humble manner, his conscience rather than my own. And I'm going to give up this liberty. I'm going to give up this liberty of mine for his sake. Now, if we continue down, verse 12, wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Do all things without murmurings and disputings, that ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world, holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. Verse 15 is what I'm after. That ye may be blameless and harmless. That's, I think, what you're talking about. Being blameless before whom? Before the one who would want to accuse us in front of our Father's face, the angelic realm. Satan is an accuser. He's the adversary who stands to accuse us before God. And he says, look at those guys, not caring about their weaker brethren, and they don't even care about making sure they live in a new life with you. They'd rather go to the idol house and yuck it up with their old buddies. And then they'll go and they'll take the communion table at church on Sunday. That's the accuser before God, before the angelic realm, doing what he does best. So blameless and harmless. Harmless. The sons of God without rebuke. What's the harmless portion? It's harmless to the other believers. It's harmless to our witness for Christ, right? It's harmless as we have young, new people coming into the body who have higher scruples than we might have because they're not established. They're not equipped yet with this new doctrine and renewing of their minds. And they're not firmly established in who they are in Christ and what some of those liberties are. And how, they're not quite there yet. So we want to be harmless to them, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke. I think that's real important, guys, in this section, and I'm looking forward to moving on from here because I think it will further inform us. Chapter 9, Paul is going to give an example of himself giving up something voluntarily for the sake of his ministry and because before God, he feels that in his own personal situation, he can't receive support and have that be a real honoring thing to God because of his specific situation. We're going to have to be very careful as we deal with that because he's not making an example for everybody else. He's talking about his own personal situation. But then he's going to go to chapter 10 and he's going to say, hey, Corinthians, you need to think carefully about your sanctified life and what it means to honor God in the details of your sanctified life. And so he's going to get real in their face about some issues that really don't have as much to do with the weaker brethren issue. It just has to do with their practice, right? Their behavior, being comfortable going back and participating at that idol house. Dad?
I'm reminded of what it says back in Romans 14, where it says, let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind.
In his own mind.
And I'm thinking, the weaker brother is not fully persuaded. And so therefore, that's a problem for him, because then he judges what he ought to do and not do on the basis of what he may see somebody else do.
Absolutely.
So I think that's kind of a fair point. I know this is the established doctrine and we're supposed to work from here, but I just think that's an important thing to remember. And
Yes.
and what that does then is that allows the stronger and the weaker brother to conduct themselves honorably before God according to their own convictions, because both have their own convictions before God.
Yes.
And hopefully those convictions include the idea of acting honorably and godly and so forth, and not doing things. You know, for me to go to an idol house of prostitution, I would never do or think of doing something like that. But, you know, that's not to say you can't have a nice dinner down there, I guess, if you think you can.
Right.
But I think
Well, you think of the old saloon in the Old West.
yeah,
You go there to get food, you go there to get drink,
information,
and the gals are upstairs.
business, yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's, and so what do? Like, maybe you order out. You know what I mean? But it's, maybe you go to the place down the road that's owned by the Christians and they don't serve, you know.
But if everybody is fully persuaded in their own mind, then the weaker brother is not going to be offended. He's not going to be.
If he's fully persuaded, but that's what makes him a weaker brother. He's influenced by you. And so that has to be part of our list of convictions as a stronger brother, that I'm not going to put a stumbling block in my weaker brother's way. And so that has to play into that. And I think that's what Paul is being very careful to say, guys, the onus is upon you, right? Because the weaker brother isn't fully persuaded in his own mind. You are, but he's not, or she is not. And so the onus is upon us to make sure we don't get in their way while they're being persuaded, right? Because they need that opportunity to be persuaded by God's word, not by us, in our example.
Just what Dad was talking about, I was kind of thinking similarly in that Romans 13, they're asked to, by that
Yes.
So there's a certain level of maturity that comes before they're asked to do these certain things. So a new believer isn't necessarily always going to have higher scruples.
Not always.
Like,
Yeah.
You're going to have them as new believers beginning to learn doctrine, and then they're asked to cast off the works of darkness. But if they're seeing
Yep.
mature believers in their midst rioting and being drunk and chambering and wantonness and these things, that's a discouragement to them.
Absolutely.
In their edification process, if they're going to be asked to cast those things off, yet they're seeing members of the body being involved in things that seem in line with those things,
Mm-hmm.
that can be a derailing situation as well.
Certainly. Certainly.
I was thinking of just a scientific fact, that if a child drinks alcohol, it's much more damaging to his system, because he's growing, that alcohol is taken into the body and it's incorporated into the cells. I saw a whole thing on this, and whereas an adult, it has a different effect on them if it's used reasonably.
Mm-hmm.
And it can actually do good for an adult, a small amount, but for a child, no.
Mm-hmm.
It's very-
Well, in the womb, it's extremely detrimental to a child, right? In their development. But then as they were growing, that would make sense.
Yeah, and there's just kind of a metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
what's the
Well, yeah. So I think we beat this thing up enough. I do think we want to keep the bigger perspective in view, because I think Paul is going to push the Corinthians to that place of, guys, do you really want to be going back to the idol house? Even if you think you're more mature and you can handle it, do you really want to do that? And so I think he's going to really push that issue just for their own selves and their own practice, not for the weaker brother's sake, but for their own walk with the Lord. So we want to get there and see that as well. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, thanks for this time and for hopefully what's profitable discussion about these things. And I appreciate different perspectives. We understand this is a little bit complicated, but Lord, maybe sometimes we need to be reminded that our liberties present a wonderful opportunity to labor with you. Our liberty to have that drink or to have that steak or that bacon or whatever it is, that can be used for the sake of a weaker brethren and given up, and you be wonderfully pleased and honored in that moment. So help us remember that. Help us remember that these liberties aren't just liberties for us to enjoy. They're liberties for us to carefully consider as we interact with others, as we interact with these new believers, folks who are not established, folks who have a conviction about the law, that we can really labor with you by being willing to give up our own liberty for that person's sake for a time. Let them get grown up. Let them get established. And help us to joy in that opportunity to labor with you and honor you in that. Thanks for all the comments and discussion today. We love you, Father, in Christ's name. Amen.